Commander Elijah Carter felt the cold splash of liquid against his chest before he even saw it coming. The bright blue drink spread across his crisp white uniform, staining the fabric and dripping onto his polished boots. The cabin fell silent as all eyes turned to the scene. "Sir, it appears you've had an accident," the tall, silver-skinned Saurian flight attendant said, voice dripping with false concern. Tivax's 4 yellow eyes narrowed, thin lips curling into what might have been a smile on a human face, but on the attendant looked more like a sneer. Elijah looked up, meeting the attendant's gaze. He had expected some resistance on this journey, but not quite so soon, and not quite so public. "That was intentional," Elijah said quietly, dabbing at his uniform with the small napkin that had come with his untouched meal. "Was it?" Tivax replied, voice rising to ensure the surrounding passengers could hear. "Perhaps if you hadn't been so fidgety. First-class passengers know how to sit properly." Around them, the luxury cabin of the Galactic Confederation flagship glittered with opulence. Crystal lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, casting rainbow patterns across the plush seating. Various alien diplomats and officials occupied most seats, their diverse forms draped in expensive fabrics and adorned with symbols of their status. Elijah took a slow breath, calming himself. "I believe there's been a mistake. I'm Commander Elijah Carter, Earth's diplomatic envoy. Your identification is clearly forged," Tivax hissed, cutting him off. "Humans don't qualify for diplomatic seating. Cargo section. Now." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Several nearby passengers turned to watch more openly now, their conversations dying away. A Viridian ambassador with emerald scales covering her face didn't bother hiding her amused smile. A pair of nocturne traders, their owl-like faces usually so expressionless, exchanged meaningful glances before looking away. None spoke up. None intervened. Elijah felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. He'd experienced this before, on other worlds, in other contexts. Earth was still new to the galactic community, still fighting for recognition and respect. Every interaction, every meeting, every moment like this one was a test. Not just of him, but of humanity's right to sit at the table. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he said quietly, extending his credentials again. The holographic badge glowed softly in his palm, displaying his rank, mission parameters, and the official seal of Earth's unified government. Tivax snatched the badge from his hand, holding it up to the light with exaggerated scrutiny. "Primitive technology. Typical human deception," the attendant scoffed, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This authorization code doesn't match any in our system." Elijah clenched his jaw. Of course it wouldn't match. Earth's codes were still being integrated into the Confederation's databases. This was a deliberate provocation, one he couldn't afford to rise to. Earth's future depended on his arrival at the Peace Summit. The treaty negotiations would determine humanity's place in galactic affairs for generations to come. If he failed to even reach the table, billions would suffer the consequences. 2 security officers approached from the front of the cabin, one a bulky Draxian with stone-like skin, the other a slender Mechanian whose partly cybernetic face betrayed no emotion. "Is there a problem here?" The Draxian rumbled, massive arms crossed over his chest. Tivax handed over Elijah's credentials with a flourish. "This human is attempting to occupy diplomatic seating with falsified documentation." The security officers examined the badge, their expressions unreadable to human eyes. "Commander," the Mechanian said, their voice artificially modulated, "please gather your belongings." Elijah looked around the cabin one last time. A few passengers had the decency to look uncomfortable now, but still, no one spoke in his defense. He thought of the 3 months of preparation, the countless briefings, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He stood slowly, gathering what dignity remained to him. The blue liquid continued to drip from his uniform, marking his path as he collected his small bag from the overhead compartment. "Very well," he said calmly. "Lead the way." As he followed the security officers toward the rear of the ship, He caught Tivax's satisfied expression. He'd face worse than prejudice to save his people. This was just the beginning of a much longer battle, one that would be fought with words and patience rather than anger. When they reached the narrow doorway leading to the cargo section, Elijah turned back once, surveying the luxury he was leaving behind. His eyes met those of an elderly Halesian diplomat, who quickly looked away in shame. Small victories, Elijah thought to himself. Sometimes that's all you get. The massive ship docked at Confederation headquarters with a gentle shudder that rippled through the hull. Elijah felt the vibration where he sat on a metal crate in the dimly lit cargo hold. The space around him was filled with containers, equipment, and the occasional maintenance droid that hummed past, ignoring his presence. For the past 6 hours, he had made this corner his own. A small area cleared among shipping containers, his tablet balanced on his knees as he reviewed his notes for the upcoming negotiations. The blue stain on his uniform had dried to an ugly dark patch, but he'd managed to clean most of it with water from a nearby maintenance station. Despite everything, a sense of calm had settled over him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last. What mattered was the mission. The tablet screen illuminated his face in the shadows as he swiped through documents detailing the complex political landscape of the Confederation. Earth needed this alliance desperately. After the climate wars and the resource collapse, humanity's future depended on access to off-world technology and trade routes. A harsh mechanical sound broke his concentration. The cargo door at the far end of the hold hissed open, bright light from the corridors spilling in like liquid gold across the floor. Elijah shielded his eyes, watching as 2 figures entered. The first was immediately recognizable. Tivax, the flight attendant from earlier, silver skin gleaming under the lights. But it was the second figure that commanded attention, tall and imposing, dressed in ceremonial armor that caught the light in dazzling patterns of blue and gold. Even without the distinctive insignia, Elijah would have recognized High Admiral Genva from the briefing files, the highest-ranking military official in the Confederation and a key figure in the upcoming peace talks. Tivax didn't notice Elijah sitting in the shadows as they led the Admiral into the cargo hold. High Admiral Genva. Tivax bowed deeply, 4-fingered hands spread in the traditional Xorlian gesture of respect. We've searched everywhere for the human diplomat. Perhaps he missed the transport entirely. Humans are notoriously unreliable with. Commander Carter. The Admiral interrupted, sharp eyes cutting through the shadows to where Elijah sat. Tivax froze mid-sentence, head snapping around to follow the Admiral's gaze. As recognition dawned, the flight attendant's silver skin visibly paled to an almost ghostly white. You know this human? Tivax asked, voice barely above a whisper. The Admiral stepped forward, ceremonial armor clinking softly with each measured step. Standing at nearly 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and skin that resembled polished bronze, Genva was an imposing presence even among the diverse species of the Confederation. This human, the Admiral said coldly, emphasizing the word Tivax had spoken with such disdain, saved 3 civilizations at Proxima when the solar flares threatened to destroy their worlds. Tivax's 4 eyes widened in horror. The peacemaker of Proxima sits in your cargo hold. The Admiral continued, voice sharp as a blade. The engineer who developed the solar shield technology that now protects 17 worlds. The diplomat who negotiated peace between the Arcturus Coalition and the Vega Dominion after 3 centuries of war. Each question seemed to physically strike Tivax, whose posture grew more hunched with every word. The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. Elijah set his tablet aside and stood, brushing off his stained uniform before stepping forward into the light. He extended his hand toward the Admiral in the human gesture of greeting. No harm done, Admiral, he said with a small smile. I've been using the time to prepare for the summit. Admiral Genva clasped Elijah's hand firmly. Commander Carter, your reputation precedes you. I apologize for this unfortunate situation. The Admiral's gaze shifted to Tivax, who seemed to be trying to shrink into nothingness. I didn't realize. Tivax began, voice trembling. The system didn't recognize. I couldn't have known. Elijah raised a hand, stopping the stream of excuses. He studied the flight attendant for a moment, seeing not arrogance now but fear. He thought of the countless times humans had misjudged each other based on appearances, on prejudices, on assumptions. How could he expect more from species that had never set foot on Earth? "He'll be my personal liaison for the summit," Elijah said, his decision made in that moment. "Second chances matter, don't they, Admiral?" The Admiral's expression shifted from anger to surprise, then to something like respect. "As you wish, Commander, though there are many who would not show such restraint." Tivax looked up, confusion replacing fear. "You want me to? After I—" "Sometimes," Elijah said quietly, gathering his tablet and small bag, "the best way to change minds is to confound expectations. I believe you'll be thorough in making amends." As they left the cargo hold together, Admiral, human, and chastened Xorlian, Elijah felt a small spark of hope. If prejudice could be overcome in this small moment, perhaps there was hope for the greater challenges that awaited at the summit. The Peace Summit had been progressing smoothly for 3 days. Elijah sat at the central table, carefully guiding discussions between 17 different species toward common ground. Tivax stood nearby, efficiently handling Elijah's communications and needs with a newfound respect that hadn't gone unnoticed by the other delegates. Then the lights flickered. A moment later, alarms blared through the station, their high-pitched wail making several delegates cover their hearing organs. The massive view screen at the front of the chamber switched to an emergency display showing multiple red sections along the station's outer ring. "What's happening?" demanded the Viridian ambassador, her scales flaring with anxiety. Before anyone could answer, a deep boom echoed through the structure. The entire chamber shook, sending delegates stumbling into each other. A second explosion followed almost immediately, stronger than the first. "Separatist attack!" Someone screamed as the emergency blast doors began closing around the delegation chamber. Elijah grabbed Tivax's arm. "What's the evacuation protocol?" The Xorlian pointed toward a door at the far end of the room that was rapidly closing. "Emergency shuttles. But we won't make it in time." Elijah looked around the room as the final blast doors sealed with a heavy thud, locking them in. 20 delegates from across the galaxy now looked to each other with growing panic. A third explosion rocked the chamber, and then the artificial gravity fluctuated, sending several delegates briefly floating before crashing back to the floor. A thin crack appeared in the viewport, small but ominous. "Systems failing," announced a calm computer voice that contrasted sharply with the chaos in the room. "Oxygen depletion in 12 minutes. Emergency protocols engage. Please remain calm." Remain calm. The Draxian security officer who had escorted Elijah to the cargo hold days earlier now pounded his stone fist against the sealed door. "We're trapped." Elijah scanned the room. Besides Tivax, he recognized the Viridian ambassador, 3 nocturne diplomats, a pair of Halisian elders, and several other species he'd been negotiating with. Most were political figures, not technical experts. "Is there an engineer among us?" Elijah called out. A Xorlian male stepped forward, his silver skin similar to Tivax's, but marked with the blue tattoos of the technical caste. "I am Chief Engineer Raxlor." Elijah pointed to the control panel near the sealed doors. "Can you override the lockdown?" The engineer rushed to the panel, fingers flying over the controls. After several tense moments, he stepped back. "Everything's locked out. The attack must have triggered security protocols I can't bypass." The crack in the viewport grew slightly wider. The air began to feel thinner. Tivax huddled in the corner, trembling visibly now. "We're going to die here," the attendant whispered, yellow eyes wide with fear. The delegates began arguing among themselves, some demanding priority when help arrived, others blaming each other's governments for the attack. The nocturne ambassadors huddled together, their owl-like eyes blinking rapidly in distress. Oxygen depletion in 10 minutes, the computer announced pleasantly. Elijah took a deep breath and surveyed the room again, this time looking for resources. There was the conference table, chairs, some decorative items, and personal devices the delegates carried. Not much to work with. He approached the control panel where the Xorlian engineer stood defeated. "Let me see," Elijah said, examining the sleek, almost featureless panel. He ran his fingers along its edges, feeling for seams. "There's nothing you can do," the engineer said. "This is integrated quantum technology. The system is completely locked down." Elijah ignored him, finding what he was looking for, a small maintenance access point nearly invisible at the bottom of the panel. He pressed it firmly, and a small compartment opened. "I need tools," Elijah announced to the room, his voice cutting through the panic. "Anything metal. And show me where the manual air circuitry would be located." The Drexian security officer scoffed. "Primitive human. This is quantum technology. What are you going to do? Hit it with a rock?" "Do you have a better idea?" Elijah asked calmly. The Drexian fell silent. The Xorlian engineer pointed reluctantly to a section of wall paneling. "The environmental controls would be behind there, but without proper tools." Elijah was already moving. He grabbed a decorative metal sculpture from a side table and approached the wall panel. "Sometimes primitive works when advanced fails," he said with a grim smile. Tivax watched from the corner as Elijah pried off the wall panel with the sculpture, revealing a complex network of circuitry and glowing conduits. The human's face showed intense concentration rather than fear. "Oxygen depletion in 8 minutes," the computer informed them cheerfully. The crack in the viewport widened further with a sound like ice breaking. The delegates fell silent, watching as the human began to work, hands moving with purpose among technology designed for beings far more advanced than his own species. Some watched with hope, others with doubt, but all of them watched. Sweat dripped from Elijah's forehead, running down his temples and into his collar as he worked. The room had grown uncomfortably hot as the environmental systems continued to fail. The crack in the viewport had stopped growing, but the hiss of escaping air was a constant reminder of their predicament. "Oxygen depletion in 6 minutes," the computer announced, still sounding oddly cheerful. Elijah had created a workspace on the floor, surrounded by improvised tools. A thin metal rod from a chair leg, a decorative pin from the Viridian ambassador's robes, and several pieces of the wall panel itself. His fingers were already cut in several places as he stripped wires with his teeth, lacking proper tools. Tivax knelt beside him, having overcome initial fear to help. The Xorlian handed him components as needed, following his quick instructions without question. "This piece next," Elijah mumbled around a wire held between his teeth. Tivax quickly placed a small crystal component in his outstretched palm. The Xorlian engineer stood over them, watching with growing interest despite his skepticism. "This cannot possibly work," he whispered. "You're attempting to bypass quantum-locked security protocols with physical manipulation." The delegates had formed a half-circle around them, their earlier panic replaced with a tense, watchful silence. The only sounds were Elijah's occasional grunts of effort and the continuing alarm. "Oxygen depletion in 5 minutes." "Almost there," Elijah said, connecting 2 unlikely components with a twist of wire. His fingers moved with practiced precision despite the pressure. He had learned long ago that panic was the enemy of progress. "Even if you restore power to the doors, the security lockdown," the engineer began. "Not trying to override security," Elijah interrupted, not looking up from his work. "Just creating a direct path for the life support." Tivax handed him another piece without being asked. Their eyes met briefly, and Elijah saw something new there. Not just fear or respect, but a growing understanding. "Humans specialize in impossible," Elijah said with a small smile, twisting the final connection together. He placed the makeshift device against the exposed circuitry and pressed 2 wires together. Nothing happened. The delegates shifted uneasily. Someone in the back sighed loudly. Elijah adjusted something, then tried again. The lights flickered, dimmed completely for 3 heartbeats, then stabilized at a brighter level than before. A mechanical hum grew louder, and suddenly fresh air began flowing through the vents above them. Life support systems restored, the computer voice announced. Emergency containment stabilized. A cheer erupted from the delegates. Several rushed forward to clap Elijah on the shoulder or offer their species equivalent of congratulations. Tuvax remained kneeling beside him, eyes wide with amazement. "How?" the Kahorlian asked. "Your technology is centuries behind ours." Elijah sat back on his heels, wiping his bloody hands on his already stained uniform. Bypassed the main processor. Created a direct physical circuit. He shrugged. Sometimes the old ways work best. The Kahorlian engineer was examining the makeshift device with open wonder. "You created a quantum bypass using only mechanical components. That should be impossible." "Yet here we are," Elijah said, standing up with a slight groan. His back ached from hunching over for so long. A loud clank came from the main doors, followed by the sound of machinery engaging. The emergency doors slowly began to slide open. Medical teams in protective gear rushed in, followed by security personnel. They began checking the delegates one by one, administering oxygen to those who seemed most affected by the depressurization. Through the open doorway strode High Admiral Genva, armor scorched in places but otherwise unharmed. The Admiral surveyed the room quickly, eyes finding Elijah amid the crowd. "Commander," the Admiral said, approaching with long strides. "The attack has been repelled. 3 separatist ships destroyed, 2 more captured." Genva looked at the improvised device still connected to the wall. Then back to Elijah. "You've saved us again, Commander." Elijah shook his head. "Just did what needed doing." Tuvax, who had remained quiet during this exchange, suddenly stood straighter. "He saved everyone," the flight attendant said, voice stronger than before. With wires and scraps." The Admiral's expression softened slightly. "Indeed." Turning back to Elijah, Genva continued. "The separatists meant to disrupt the peace talks by eliminating key delegates. They failed, thanks to you." One by one, the delegates approached Elijah, offering formal thanks according to their various customs. The Viridian ambassador bowed deeply, scales shimmering. The Nocturne diplomats performed a series of synchronized blinks that Elijah recognized as their highest honor. As the medical team finally reached him, insisting on treating his cut hands, Elijah caught Tuvax watching him with an unreadable expression. "What?" he asked quietly. "I'm beginning to understand," Tuvax replied. "Why they call you the peacemaker." 3 days after the attack, the peace talks resumed with renewed urgency. What might have taken weeks was accomplished in hours, as the shared danger had created an unusual bond among the delegates. Elijah led the discussions with quiet authority, finding common ground where others saw only differences. Now, in the Great Hall of the Confederation headquarters, thousands of beings from across the galaxy gathered to witness history. The vast chamber, with its soaring crystal ceiling that reflected the light of 3 nearby stars, fell completely silent as Elijah concluded his presentation of the final peace treaty. "And so, with this agreement, we pledge not just peace between our worlds, but a future of cooperation and mutual respect," Elijah said, his voice carrying clearly through the perfect acoustics of the hall. "Earth is honored to take its place among the stars, not as conquerors or subjects, but as equals and friends." He stepped back from the podium, the holographic display of the treaty floating above the central table, its text translated simultaneously into 17 different languages. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the 12 members of the Supreme Council rose from their seats, different in form and feature, some with multiple limbs, others with no limbs at all, some towering giants, others barely visible to the human eye, yet united in their response. Unanimous approval, the first in the Confederation's 3,000-year history. The crowd erupted in sounds of celebration. everything from human applause to the haunting harmonic whistles of the nocturne, from the thunderous foot-stomping of the Draxians to the silent light displays of the Hillyrians. The High Chancellor, an ancient being whose crystalline body reflected the light in dazzling patterns, floated forward. In their hands they carried a small box made of a material that seemed to shift between solid and liquid. "We recognize Commander Elijah Carter with our highest honor," announced the High Chancellor, their voice like wind through crystal. "The Order of the Seven Stars is bestowed only upon those who have changed the course of our shared history." The box opened, revealing the glowing crystal medallion suspended in an energy field. As the Chancellor placed it around Elijah's neck, the crystal seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Elijah bowed deeply, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just for him. It was for Earth, for humanity, for their future among the stars. But as he straightened, he saw Tivax standing at attention near the back of the platform. The Exorlian who had started as his adversary had become his most dedicated assistant during the negotiations, working tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly. "Thank you, High Chancellor, for this tremendous honor," Elijah said. "But I did not accomplish this alone." He turned and gestured toward Tivax. "I had invaluable assistance." This officer demonstrated the true spirit of cooperation that lies at the heart of this treaty. Tivax froze, all four eyes widening in shock. The Horlian had clearly not expected to be mentioned, let alone praised before the assembled dignitaries of the entire Confederation. "Step forward, please," Elijah said warmly. Tivax moved as if in a dream, approaching the center of the platform where Elijah and the High Chancellor stood. "This officer showed me that change is possible," Elijah continued, "that old prejudices can be overcome, that understanding can replace fear. And isn't that what this treaty truly represents?" The High Chancellor studied Tivax for a moment, then nodded. "Indeed, Commander, the journey from ignorance to wisdom is the most important one any being can make." They removed a smaller crystal from their robes and presented it to Tivax. "For service to the Confederation." Tivax accepted the crystal with trembling hands, bowing so deeply that their forehead nearly touched the floor. The ceremony continued, but the moment had left its mark on everyone present. Not just the treaty, but the story behind it would be told for generations to come. Hours later, as the celebrations continued around them in the great reception hall, Tivax finally found a moment to approach Elijah alone. The human stood by a viewport, looking out at the stars. "Commander," Tivax said quietly, "I must ask you something." Elijah turned, smiling. "Of course. Why did you help me after how I treated you? You could have had me removed from service, or worse. Instead, you elevated me." Tivax's voice was filled with genuine confusion. "I don't understand." Elijah looked thoughtfully at the stars before answering. "Because appearances deceive. Just as you judged me by my human form, I could have judged you by your first mistake." He turned back to the Xorlian. "But neither of us is defined by a single moment or a single aspect of ourselves." Tivax was silent for a long moment, absorbing the words. Then, with newfound certainty, the Corlian nodded slowly. "I will tell others what I learned today. It is not the strength of our technology that defines us, but the strength of our character." Elijah smiled, touching the medallion at his neck. "I think that's a lesson all our species can benefit from." Outside the viewport, a transport ship from Earth was arriving, the first of many that would now freely travel the stars. As they watched it dock, human and Xorlian stood side by side, no longer separated by prejudice or fear, just two beings under the same stars, facing the same future.